Emily was just another face in the crowd of small-town life. At 24, she had lived in the same town all her life, working as a waitress in a local diner where she knew every regular by name and every corner of the place by heart. She wasn't rich, she wasn't poor, but she was always just enough on the outside looking in. Her shift was ending on a crisp Friday afternoon when a piece of paper on the counter caught her eye. It was a glittery, gold-embossed invitation to a party at Sarah's place. Emily knew exactly who Sarah was. The wealthiest girl in town, head of every social group, and often the subject of whispered stories among the locals. Sarah wasn't just rich, she was untouchable in Emily's eyes. The people who attended her parties were always the same, fashionable, stunning, with lives so different from Emily's that she almost couldn't imagine the world they inhabited. But this invitation, it was unexpected, to say the least. Emily paused, looking at the invitation in disbelief. She didn't belong at these kinds of events. She'd never been part of the elite crowd, and the idea of stepping into that world made her feel like a fish out of water. For a long moment, she wondered if it was a mistake, maybe it was meant for someone else. But then, the curiosity grew. She thought back to her mundane routine, to the endless days of washing dishes and taking orders, serving food to people who never really noticed her, always feeling just a little invisible. Maybe, she thought, this could be her chance. A chance to step outside the role she had been playing in the background of her life. What could she lose? Emily tucked the card into her pocket and began to prepare herself for something completely unfamiliar. She stood in front of her bedroom mirror that evening, staring at the new dress she had bought on a whim. It was elegant and slightly out of her budget, but she hoped it would help her blend into the world of polished smiles and perfect lives. Emily felt her heart race as she imagined stepping into the grandiose mansion Sarah called home. Would they laugh at her? Would they notice she didn't belong? There were so many questions swirling in her mind, but one thought kept repeating itself: maybe tonight, she could leave the label of ordinary behind. But then doubt crept in. She thought of her coworkers back at the diner, of the way people in town whispered when they thought no one was listening. Her mom's advice echoed in her mind: don't let people treat you like you're nothing just because they have more. Emily knew the harsh truths of living in a small town, where wealth and status defined everything. Yet, she couldn't help but feel a sliver of hope. For once, she wanted to be seen, truly seen, not for her background or job but for the person she could be if only someone gave her a chance. The night of the party, Emily hesitated for a moment before heading out the door. It felt like stepping into a different world. Her friends had warned her, though. They'd told her that Sarah was known for being cruel, especially to people who weren't her kind. But Emily pushed those thoughts aside. She was determined not to let fear dictate her actions. She drove up the long, winding driveway to the massive house, its lights gleaming in the darkness. As she approached the door, she almost turned back. She was unsure if she was ready to face whatever waited inside. But something inside her pushed her forward, and soon she found herself standing at the entrance of Sarah's mansion, knocking on the door that felt like a barrier to a world she didn't belong in. When the door opened, Emily's nerves nearly overtook her. She was met by a tall, blonde woman in a designer dress that cost more than Emily's entire monthly paycheck. It was Sarah, and as she greeted Emily, her smile was warm but cold at the same time, as if she were trying to make her feel welcome while knowing full well that Emily didn't belong there. Emily stepped into the party, her eyes widening as she took in the extravagant surroundings. Guests in their expensive outfits laughed and chatted, holding champagne flutes as if they had nothing to worry about in the world. She felt like an imposter. The clinking of glasses, the soft hum of jazz music in the background, and the gentle murmur of conversation all seemed to whisper the same thing: you're not one of us. Yet, she forced a smile, nodding in acknowledgement as Sarah introduced her to the other guests. It was easy to spot the subtle, almost imperceptible ways they all tried to make Emily feel inferior. The way Sarah's friends would glance at her dress and then back at each other, the way the men talked to her as if she were a curiosity, something to be looked at and discarded. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in the room knew she didn't belong. As the evening wore on, the mockery became more overt. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Emily found herself at a table with a few women who were talking about their latest vacations to Paris, their brand new designer handbags, and their plans for the upcoming high society gala. Emily had never been to Paris, and the only designer thing she owned was a second-hand coat from a local thrift store. As she tried to join in the conversation, the women barely acknowledged her, instead nodding politely but dismissively. One of them, a woman named Clara, even made a comment about how nice it was to see someone from the real world attending such a high-class event. It wasn't said directly, but the implication was clear. Emily felt the sting of the words and knew that Sarah's invitation had been nothing more than a cruel joke. They weren't inviting her because they wanted her there, they were inviting her to mock her. Emily's heart sank. She wanted to leave. But then, she stopped herself. Maybe this was the moment that would define her, maybe, just maybe. As the night stretched on, Emily's discomfort deepened. The laughter around her began to feel like daggers aimed at her self-esteem. She had always been a quiet observer, used to blending into the background, but tonight, that wasn't possible. The world she was surrounded by was so foreign, so unrecognizable from the life she'd known. Every conversation seemed to revolve around wealth, luxury, and experiences that Emily could never have imagined. She tried to participate, offering polite responses to the topics being discussed, but the others merely nodded with slight, condescending smiles, never really listening. It was as though they didn't expect anything she said to be important. She felt invisible in a way that made her physically shrink. By the time the party had fully settled into a rhythm, Emily found herself on the outskirts of the main group, standing near a large window with a drink in her hand. The mansion's view of the town below looked peaceful, but it felt far away, almost like a different life. She wasn't part of this world. She never would be. Yet, despite everything that felt wrong, there was a part of her that resisted the pull to just leave. She'd already come this far, and she wasn't about to let them see her back out now. But the weight of the isolation pressed down on her. She thought about the conversations she had heard when she first arrived, people commenting on her dress, the way she walked, the way she spoke. Emily knew they were mocking her. She didn't belong here, and they knew it. She could see it in their eyes, the subtle judgment, the quiet whispers when they thought she wasn't listening. Every glance, every laugh behind her back, every raised eyebrow felt like a reminder that she was out of her depth. Then, it happened. Sarah approached her with a group of her closest friends, her face lit up in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm so glad you could make it, Emily," Sarah said in a voice that was syrupy sweet, a little too much so. "We don't get many people from your background, you know." Emily's stomach churned, but she kept her composure, offering a polite smile. Sarah glanced at her friends, and they exchanged knowing looks. Emily recognized the game. Sarah wasn't being kind, she was mocking her. The others chuckled, a few of them making thinly veiled comments about the way Emily looked. "You know," one of Sarah's friends, a woman named Chloe, said with a smirk, "it's so nice to see someone like you here. It's so charming, really." Her tone was dripping with sarcasm. Emily's heart raced, and for a moment, she wanted nothing more than to disappear. She wasn't sure how much more of this she could take. But then, something unexpected happened. Emily caught the eye of James, one of the few men at the party who had seemed somewhat distant from the clique. He hadn't spoken to her much, but there was something different about him. He wasn't part of the group, and as Emily locked eyes with him, she noticed something that gave her a flicker of hope, a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. He saw her. She could turn the tables on them. Emily's mind raced. Why was he the only one who didn't treat her like a joke? The others were like wolves, circling, and she was the prey. Sarah continued to lead the group, oblivious to the inner turmoil she had caused, encouraging the laughter and snide comments. At that moment, Emily had a choice. She could continue to play along, endure the humiliation for a few more hours, and then slip away quietly, never to return. Or, she could confront the situation head-on and show them who she really was. She thought about the years of working in the diner, of never being seen for anything other than her job, her status, her background. It had always been the same, people saw her as just a waitress, just a part of the background, nothing more. But tonight, she wasn't going to be that person. Tonight, she would make them see her for who she was, not for the label they had assigned her. The decision came swiftly, without much thought. Emily set her drink down and turned toward Sarah and her group. She walked over to them with purpose, her feet steady on the marble floor. The laughter died down as she approached. All eyes were on her, and for the first time, she didn't feel small. Sarah looked at her with raised eyebrows, clearly expecting her to slink back into the background, but Emily stood her ground. "I think I owe you an apology, Sarah," Emily said, her voice clear and steady, though her heart was hammering in her chest. "I didn't realize that showing up here meant becoming the butt of your jokes. But now that I know, I'm glad I came. It's not every day I get to see the true colors of people like you." The group fell silent, the atmosphere shifting from one of casual mockery to something else. Sarah's face flushed with a mix of surprise and irritation, but Emily didn't let it affect her. She took a deep breath and continued, her voice rising with conviction. "You invited me here not because you thought I'd fit in, but because you thought it would be funny. You thought I'd just stand there and take your insults, but I'm not that person. I'm more than just the girl from the diner. I'm more than the job I have, the clothes I wear, or the money in my bank account. And if you can't see that, then that's on you, not me." For a brief moment, there was no sound. The room had gone completely still. People glanced around, unsure of how to react. Then, Sarah forced a laugh, but it was hollow. She tried to mask her discomfort, but Emily could see the cracks in her facade. Well, Sarah said, her voice shaky. "Looks like someone's gotten a little too big for their britches." Emily didn't flinch. Instead, she met Sarah's gaze and held it, not backing down. Sarah's friends exchanged uneasy glances, their smirks faltering. The game had changed, and they didn't know how to handle it. Emily wasn't the meek, invisible girl they thought she was. She wasn't going to let them mock her any longer. As the silence stretched on, Emily could feel the eyes of the room on her, weighing her every word. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't shrinking under their gaze. She was standing tall. And she wasn't going anywhere. The room seemed to hold its breath for a long moment, the air thick with tension. Emily's words hung in the air, reverberating off the grand walls of Sarah's mansion. No one spoke, no one moved, as though they were waiting for the next step in a play they didn't understand. Emily stood firm, her hands gripping the edges of her dress, her heart beating a little faster than before, but her resolve unwavering. Sarah's face was flushed, her lips pressed into a thin line, as though the words Emily had spoken had pierced through her perfect armor. She wasn't used to being challenged, and Emily could see that in the way her eyes flickered, searching for something, anything to regain control of the situation. But Emily wasn't giving her that power anymore. She wasn't just another girl at a party, she was someone with a voice, with worth, and she wasn't afraid to show it. The silence finally broke when Clara, one of Sarah's friends, let out an uncomfortable chuckle. It wasn't a laugh of amusement, but more of a nervous reflex. "Well, this is fun," she said, attempting to play it off with a forced smile, but the unease in her voice was clear. "Maybe we should all be a little more down-to-earth like Emily here." There was no warmth in her tone, just a thinly veiled mockery. Emily didn't back down. She kept her chin high and her eyes locked with Sarah's, refusing to let them see her waver. It wasn't just about proving a point to them anymore. It was about reclaiming her own dignity, her own worth. The tension thickened, and for a few seconds, Emily wondered if she had made a mistake. But then, the unexpected happened. James, the man who had locked eyes with her earlier in the evening, stepped forward. He was tall, with a calm demeanor that contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. His presence had been almost unnoticed up until now, a quiet observer among the loud, flashy crowd. But when he spoke, his voice was clear and firm, and it cut through the discomfort like a knife. "I think you've made your point, Emily," he said, his gaze shifting to Sarah and her friends. "Maybe it's time we stop pretending this is some kind of competition. We're all human here, aren't we?" His words weren't dramatic, but they carried weight. There was no malice in his tone, just the quiet authority of someone who had seen too much to play games. For a brief moment, the group was stunned into silence. Sarah's lips parted as if she wanted to respond, but the words didn't come. The power she had once wielded with ease now felt fragile, slipping through her fingers. Emily saw it, the way the others hesitated, unsure of how to react. No one wanted to be the first to back down, but no one wanted to push further either. The energy of the room had shifted. The people who had once seemed so confident, so untouchable, were suddenly uncertain. It wasn't Emily who had changed, it was them. The mockery that had once felt so familiar now seemed out of place, almost childish in comparison to the unspoken challenge she had thrown down. Sarah's friends exchanged awkward glances, clearly unsure of how to regain control of the conversation. Sarah, still red-faced but now visibly flustered, tried to laugh it off. "Well, I guess we've all learned a valuable lesson tonight," she said, but it sounded forced, like she was trying to salvage her image. "I'm sorry if I made you feel uncomfortable, Emily. That wasn't my intention." Emily didn't respond immediately. She stood there for a moment, letting the words hang in the air. She could have accepted the apology, could have smoothed things over and left with her pride intact. But something inside her told her that this was bigger than that. She wasn't going to let them erase the moment, let them make it disappear with a shallow apology. "I appreciate the apology, Sarah," she said slowly, her voice steady. "But I don't need your sympathy. I didn't come here looking for your approval. I came here because I thought maybe, just maybe, I could show you that I'm more than what you think I am. I'm more than your assumptions about me." She took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "And I think you all need to start seeing people for who they really are, not for the labels you slap on them." There was a shift in the atmosphere, an undeniable ripple. It wasn't just Emily speaking anymore, it was something that felt like a declaration, a challenge to the very core of the way they had treated her. For the first time, she wasn't just standing up for herself, she was standing up for everyone they had ever underestimated, ignored, or discarded because of where they came from or what they wore. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't awkward or uncomfortable, it was thoughtful. The others were beginning to absorb what Emily had said. And in that moment, something changed. James looked at Emily with a nod of approval, and for the first time all night, Sarah seemed to shrink just a little, as if the weight of the situation had finally dawned on her. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly, no longer trying to mask the tension. "I never thought about it that way." The party, once filled with loud music and laughter, now felt more subdued. People began to trickle off to other parts of the house, conversations resuming, but with an undeniable shift in energy. Sarah and her friends, though still unsure how to process what had just happened, had lost their hold on the evening. Emily had broken through the invisible walls they had erected. She wasn't just the poor girl from the diner anymore, she had become the person who had dared to challenge them, to force them to see her and others like her in a new light. As the night wore on, Sarah came up to Emily again, this time without her usual arrogance. She offered a genuine, if reluctant, smile. "I never expected that from you," she said quietly, her voice softer now. "You really showed us something tonight." Emily smiled back, her heart lighter than it had been all evening. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about something deeper. About dignity, about respect, about refusing to let others define who she was. As she walked toward the door to leave, she felt a quiet sense of pride settle over her. She had come to the party expecting mockery, but she had left with something far more valuable, the respect of herself and a recognition that she didn't need anyone's approval to be worthy. As the cool night air hit her face, she knew that this night would be one she would remember for the rest of her life. And maybe, just maybe, the people inside would remember it too. The days following that fateful night felt like they had shifted the very fabric of Emily's life. She had expected some form of confrontation or backlash after her bold stand, but instead, the world around her seemed to move in strange, subtle ways, nudged by the events at the party. It was as if the ripple she had caused in the atmosphere had slowly begun to change the way people saw her, and, in turn, how she saw herself. The next morning, as she woke up to the sound of her alarm blaring, she couldn't help but smile to herself. There had been a time, not long ago, when she would have felt completely out of place in that mansion, as though she had no right to be there, no right to stand her ground against people who seemed to live in a different world. But now, something had clicked inside her. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She wasn't going to shrink away just because someone thought she didn't belong. The quiet power she felt after confronting Sarah had stayed with her, and with each passing day, it seemed to grow stronger. At work, things felt subtly different. The usual patrons at the diner had always been familiar faces. Regulars who came in for their morning coffee or the simple comfort of a warm meal. They never judged her or made her feel lesser, but she had always felt as though she was in the background. The girl who served their meals and smiled politely, but nothing more. But after the party, Emily had begun to carry herself differently. She walked into the diner with her head a little higher, her steps a little more confident. And it didn't go unnoticed. The regulars, who had always been kind but unremarkable in their attentiveness, started to treat her with a newfound respect. They saw something in her now, something that wasn't just the waitress behind the counter, but a person with a story, with strength, with a voice that had been silenced for too long. And that shift in perception was contagious. Her co-workers, who had never given much thought to the life outside of their small, simple town, began to look at her differently as well. The way they greeted her changed, their smiles warmer, their small conversations more genuine. It wasn't that Emily had changed, she was still the same person, but the way the world saw her had transformed. She had shaken off the chains of self-doubt, and in doing so, she had unknowingly liberated others around her. It wasn't just in her small world of work that things had shifted. Emily's phone began to buzz with messages from people she hadn't expected to hear from. James, the quiet man from the party, reached out first, offering a simple text, "I respect what you did that night." It took guts. There was no expectation behind it, no attempt to make her feel indebted to him. It was just a small acknowledgement that Emily had taken a stand, and that didn't go unnoticed. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was someone who understood the quiet strength it took to speak up in a room full of people who didn't want to listen. Over the next few days, more messages trickled in. Some were from people she had known for years, people from high school or acquaintances she had lost touch with. They all spoke with a similar tone, admiration, respect, and sometimes, a tinge of surprise. They had seen the party unfold through social media, but they hadn't truly understood what had happened until they spoke to her directly. To Emily, it felt as though they were seeing her for the first time. They were seeing the woman she had become, not the woman she had been. But not everyone was quick to embrace the change. Sarah's clique, the people who had once mocked her, began to treat her with a strange mix of avoidance and false politeness. There were no more snide comments or cutting remarks, but there was also no warmth or true acknowledgement. It was as though they were trying to pretend the entire incident had never happened. It stung a little. Emily didn't expect them to suddenly become her friends or to apologize for the way they had treated her, but she had hoped for some form of growth, some sign that they had learned from the experience. But instead, they had chosen to ignore the elephant in the room, pretending as if nothing had changed. That wasn't what bothered Emily, though. What bothered her was the realization that they hadn't been the ones to change, they had only been forced to see things differently. They had never truly understood her before, and they likely never would. That was a bitter pill to swallow, but it also marked a turning point. Emily no longer cared if Sarah and her friends liked her or saw her worth. Their approval had never been the key to her happiness. The key had always been her own sense of self, her own understanding of her value. She was no longer willing to bend to their expectations, and that truth felt like both a weight lifted and a foundation built. A few weeks passed, and Emily found herself thinking back on the night of the party. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet at the same time, it felt like a pivotal moment that had shaped everything that came after. She had always feared confrontation, always feared being cast out, but the moment she had decided to stand up for herself, she had inadvertently changed the course of her life. The consequences of her actions weren't just external, they had altered her from within. She had discovered a strength she didn't know she had, and that realization fueled every decision she made from that point on. Her confidence wasn't just a facade anymore. It was a part of who she was, something she could carry with her into every room she entered, every conversation she had, and every challenge she faced. The more she reflected, the more Emily realized that this wasn't just about that one party, that one evening of mockery. It was about something far greater, her journey toward owning her worth and no longer letting anyone define her based on their own prejudices or expectations. She had learned that true power wasn't in the approval of others, it was in the belief in yourself, the ability to stand tall even when the world told you to shrink. One day, as Emily sat at the counter of the diner, serving coffee to a regular customer, she looked up to find James walking in. He gave her a nod, a small smile, and ordered a coffee. The simple gesture was enough to make her heart beat a little faster. There was something about him, something calm and steady that made her feel at ease. Over the next few weeks, their conversations grew longer. He was kind, funny, and thoughtful, someone who made her think in ways she hadn't before. It wasn't that she had been looking for someone to validate her, but there was a comfort in knowing that she had found someone who truly understood her journey. They would meet outside of work, go on quiet walks through the park, or sit in cafes, discussing everything from the world around them to their hopes and fears. Slowly, Emily started to realize that her life was no longer defined by the limitations she had once accepted. She was building something real and lasting. She wasn't the poor girl who had stumbled into a party to be mocked. She was a woman who had found her voice, her strength, and her own sense of purpose. And in that realization, Emily found a deeper peace. The past no longer had a hold on her. She had transcended it. The girl who had once felt like an outsider was now carving her own path, creating a life where she no longer needed anyone's approval to feel worthy. The world, for all its harshness and expectations, had become her canvas, and she was ready to paint her own masterpiece. She had silenced the doubters, not with words, but with the quiet strength of her actions. And that, Emily knew, was the greatest victory of all. As the months passed, Emily continued to grow into the person she had always known she could be, but hadn't fully realized until that defining moment at the party. Life, it seemed, was moving in a direction she hadn't anticipated, one where her confidence and resilience became her greatest strengths. Each day, as she walked through the familiar streets of her town, she felt different. The weight of the past no longer clung to her like a heavy cloak. Instead, she was beginning to build a future for herself, one where she was not just surviving, but thriving. There were days when it felt almost surreal. She had gone from the quiet girl with dreams tucked away in the back of her mind to a woman who was making bold choices, not just for herself but for the people she cared about. The diner, which had always been a small corner of the world where she served others, began to feel like a place of significance. It wasn't just a job anymore, it was part of her story, part of the foundation she was building. One evening, after her shift, Emily sat with James on the worn bench outside the diner, the night air cool but refreshing. Their conversations had evolved, no longer about small talk but about the deeper things, the dreams they had, the struggles they faced, the things they wanted out of life. It wasn't about romance for her. At least, not in the way people expected. She hadn't been looking for a fairy tale, but rather a partnership, an equal exchange of trust, respect, and understanding. She had never fully grasped the depth of what it meant to have someone by your side until she found herself sharing more with him than she had ever expected. He listened to her with genuine care, his eyes always attentive, never rushing her to speak, but instead valuing every word that left her lips. And slowly, Emily began to open up more, to trust more, not just him, but the world around her. It was as though she was learning to live again, but this time with the knowledge that she didn't have to hold herself back. But it wasn't just the people closest to her who had taken notice of the change. Emily's newfound confidence had begun to ripple through her entire community. It wasn't dramatic at first. Small changes here and there, a friendly smile from someone who used to look past her, a handshake from a customer who now greeted her as an equal rather than someone who simply served them. At first, it was subtle. A shift in the way people spoke to her, a hint of respect in their voices, a shared acknowledgement of her worth. But it became more pronounced over time. Emily had, in many ways, become a quiet but undeniable symbol of change in her town. The girl who had once been ridiculed, ignored, and underestimated was now the one who showed up, stood tall, and made her voice heard when it mattered. In the eyes of those around her, she was no longer just a figure in the background. She had become a role model for those who had always wondered if it was possible to stand up and fight for yourself when the odds seemed stacked against you. One day, as Emily walked down the street to the diner, she passed a group of teenagers sitting on the curb. They were laughing, joking with each other, but as she drew near, one of them, Lila, a girl who had been a high school acquaintance, someone who had often been part of the crowd that looked down on Emily, caught her eye. Emily gave her a small nod, her usual polite smile in place, and for a brief moment, she thought she would keep walking. But then Lila stood up. "Hey, Emily," she called out, her voice a little hesitant but not unfriendly. "I just wanted to say. I've been hearing things about how you stood up to Sarah at that party. And I think it's pretty amazing." The words were unexpected, and for a second, Emily wasn't sure how to respond. But she didn't let the surprise show. She simply smiled, nodding again. "Thanks, Lila. It wasn't anything big." But in the silence that followed, Emily realized that it wasn't just about the event at the party anymore. The people who had watched her stand up for herself were starting to see that there was more to her than they had ever realized. They were starting to recognize the quiet strength she had always carried, the same strength she had once hidden away because she thought it was worthless. Later that evening, after closing the diner, Emily sat in her apartment, the quiet hum of the city outside her window. It was just a small space, but it was hers. Her sanctuary. A place where she could think, reflect, and plan for what was next. She had always been someone who pushed others to be better, to not settle for less, but now, she was pushing herself in ways she had never imagined. She had become something she hadn't even known she could be, a woman who took control of her life, who wasn't afraid to speak out when she needed to, and who wasn't afraid to take risks anymore. The doubts she once carried, the fears that had kept her in the shadows, were no longer a part of her daily thoughts. She had stepped into a space of growth, and that growth wasn't limited to just her career or relationships, it was about her entire worldview. The changes weren't just internal, either. Emily was slowly beginning to change the way she saw the future. She hadn't always known what she wanted to do with her life, but now, the possibilities felt endless. She had once thought that success was only for people who came from wealth, from privilege, from a world that was so far removed from her own. But now she understood that success wasn't just about money or status. It was about the courage to be yourself, the willingness to fight for what you believe in, and the ability to rise above the opinions of others. Emily started to dream again, her mind filled with ideas for her future. Maybe she could start her own business, maybe she could move to a new city, maybe she could pursue something completely different. She wasn't sure yet, but she knew one thing: she was no longer afraid of what the future might bring. It could be anything. And she was ready for it. But before she could make any big decisions, something unexpected happened that tested her resolve once more. One afternoon, a letter arrived at her door. The envelope was crisp, the return address unmistakable. It was from Sarah. Emily hesitated for a moment before tearing open the envelope. Inside was a brief note: "I don't know what made you speak up that night, but I think you're right. I've been reflecting a lot. You don't need my approval, but I wanted to say, I'm sorry for how I treated you. I never meant to hurt you. I hope we can start over." Emily stared at the letter for a long time. It wasn't an apology she had expected, and certainly not from Sarah, the person who had once made her feel worthless. It wasn't a complete redemption, but it was a step toward something unexpected. Emily could have let the bitterness take over, could have dismissed it as just another attempt to make herself feel better, but she didn't. She folded the letter, set it down, and smiled softly to herself. It wasn't about the apology. It was about how far she had come since that night. She no longer needed the approval of people who had once made her feel small. She had found her voice, and nothing, not even Sarah's apology, could take that away. In the months that followed, Emily continued on her path of self-discovery. She knew that life wasn't always going to be easy, but she was no longer afraid of the challenges ahead. She had faced the worst of it: mockery, judgment, and rejection, and had come out stronger. She had learned that her worth was not tied to the opinions of others. It was a lesson that would stay with her forever. And as she looked toward the future, she knew one thing for certain: nothing could stop her now. She was ready for whatever came next, because she was no longer just the girl who had been invited to a party to be mocked. She was the woman who had turned the tables and had come out victorious. As the seasons changed, Emily found herself in a place she had never expected. Life, which had once seemed like a series of days filled with routine and uncertainty, was now unfolding in ways that felt bold and purposeful. She was no longer the girl who lived in the shadows, constantly questioning her worth or seeking validation from people who had never truly understood her. She had outgrown that version of herself, and with each passing day, she felt the weight of her past grow lighter. Her relationship with James deepened, but it wasn't in the way she had expected. Their connection was not defined by fairy tale moments, but by something more grounded: mutual respect, shared goals, and an understanding of what it meant to face the world on your own terms. There was a quiet comfort in knowing that they were in it together, not as two halves of a whole, but as two whole individuals who had both been through their own struggles and had come out stronger for it. Their conversations grew more profound, and they began to dream together. There were no longer just small hopes about getting through the next week or month, but larger ambitions: places they wanted to travel, things they wanted to build, causes they wanted to support. The future was no longer something that happened to them, it was something they were creating, hand in hand. But even as she built this new life with James, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story, more to the town she had grown up in, and more to the people she had left behind. She had come so far, but there were still pieces of herself and her past that needed to be put together. She had reached a point where the lessons of the past no longer felt like burdens. They were lessons, ones that would carry her through whatever challenges lay ahead. One afternoon, as she was closing up the diner after a busy lunch rush, Emily noticed Lila sitting at one of the tables by the window, looking a little lost in thought. Their past had been distant, but there was a familiarity to the way Lila sat there, a kind of vulnerability that Emily had never expected to see in someone who had once been part of Sarah's circle. She had no reason to approach, yet something inside her told her it was time. Walking over, Emily offered a soft smile. "Lila, I didn't expect to see you here. Everything okay?" Lila looked up, startled at first, but then a small, genuine smile tugged at her lips. "Yeah, just thinking. I've been wanting to talk to you, actually." Emily took a seat across from her, intrigued but cautious. Lila had never been a person she would have considered a close friend, but something had changed between them. Maybe it was the shared experience of being at that party, of seeing the world shift around them in a way they couldn't control. Lila's voice was quiet as she spoke, but the weight of her words was undeniable. "I've been thinking a lot about the way I treated you, and the way Sarah treated you. It wasn't right. I can't imagine how it must have felt, and I think I always just went along with it. You know, because it was easier. But I see now that I was wrong. I see now that what you did that night wasn't just about you. It was about everyone in that room. You stood up, and I respect that." Emily listened, trying to process what she was hearing. She had never expected an apology, let alone this kind of acknowledgement from Lila. It was easy to brush it off, to dismiss it as empty words, but something in Lila's eyes told Emily that this was different. Lila was truly reflecting on the past, on the way the social dynamics had shaped their lives in that small town. It wasn't about Emily forgiving her or even asking for forgiveness. It was about something more profound, recognizing the ways people change, the way everyone has their own story, their own battles they fight in silence. And maybe, just maybe, this moment of honesty was part of the larger shift in the town itself. In that moment, Emily realized that her actions hadn't just affected her own life. They had started something far bigger. The ripple she had caused wasn't just felt by the people at the party. It had slowly begun to spread throughout the community, shifting the way people viewed themselves, the way they viewed one another. The town, once divided by invisible lines of class and status, was beginning to unravel those divisions. It wasn't all at once, and it wasn't easy. But Emily could feel it. The change that had started the night she spoke out had planted a seed, and that seed was beginning to sprout in ways she hadn't expected. Lila wasn't the only one who had started to see things differently. There were more conversations like this one, more moments of people admitting their wrongs, their misjudgments, and their regrets. Emily didn't know if this transformation would last or if it would fade as quickly as it had come, but she knew that it had already made a difference. It was a difference she could feel in her bones, a sense of connection, of people recognizing their shared humanity, of realizing that everyone had a story, a reason for who they were, and a right to be heard. The town wasn't perfect, and the people who lived there weren't perfect either. But there was a new sense of possibility, a new understanding that people could change, could learn, and could grow. That was the power Emily had unlocked by speaking her truth. That evening, as Emily walked home from the diner, she felt a peace she hadn't known before. It wasn't a peace born of perfection or the absence of conflict. It was a peace born of knowing that she had made the choice to live her life on her own terms, to stop hiding from the world and let her truth be seen. It was a peace that came from knowing that the world around her was slowly changing, too, not because of one single moment, but because people were beginning to open their eyes to the truth of what it meant to live authentically. She had done the hard work. She had faced her fears, confronted her past, and walked through the fire of judgment and mockery. And now, she stood on the other side, not as someone who had been defeated, but as someone who had emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident than she had ever imagined. Her story wasn't just her own anymore. It was part of something larger, part of a movement that was changing the way people saw each other and the world around them. And that was just the beginning. Emily had learned that the true power in life came not from avoiding confrontation, but from embracing it when it was necessary, from standing tall even when the world told you to shrink. The path ahead was still unknown, but she knew she was ready for whatever it had in store. Because no matter what happened, Emily had already won. She had reclaimed her voice, her worth, and her future. And that was all she needed.